In Galatians, the 2nd chapter and the 20th verse is one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. It's a short statement, but it's a statement that means a great deal. After Paul had been talking to writing to the Galatians about his own relationship to the other apostles and things, he talks about himself for a while. And in this he said, "Life that I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ then died for nothing." Well, Christ died in vain. The expression that I like here is his expression, "the life that I now live." Paul had a number of things to look back on in his life. We don't know the details of a great deal of his life, but we do know something about the general character of his life. He tells us in the Philippian letter that he was of the tribe of Benjamin. He talks about the fact that he was a persecutor of the church. He mentions the fact that he was a Pharisee, that he held very strictly to the traditions of the elders. Well, when we look back into the history of the Pharisees and all, we can see something about probably what his lifestyle was like. Now, we don't know of anything kind of connection that Paul ever had with Jesus Christ, but we do know something about the Pharisees' connection with Jesus Christ. And so we can put Paul kind of into that general character category, I guess we might say. The Pharisees opposed Jesus on a number of different grounds, but particularly it was the grounds of he violated the traditions of the elders. Now we don't like that. We say to ourselves, traditions are wrong. Well, we have a lot of our own traditions. People don't stop to think about the fact, but we do. We have a lot of our own traditions. And some of those traditions are very good. Some of them are not very good. Let me just mention one that began to have the force of right and wrong. There was a preacher in Atlanta, Georgia one time who preached for one of the congregations there. And a group of us preachers got together. We were talking about the worship and various things about how the worship was conducted, how it was carried on and everything. And someone said, well, we're going to move the Lord's Supper from having it at the end of the service, and we're going to have it before the sermon. And this preacher spoke up and he said, I don't know about that. Well, what's the matter with it? Well, we just never have done it that way. I don't think we ought to be changing it. And to him, this was a violation of the way it's always been, should we say, something like that. And he was very uncomfortable with that. That's one reason that we need to be very flexible in reference to quite a number of things. Now, let me look at the other side of this. The other side of it is that a lot of people think that everything in churches of Christ is just traditional. What we believe is traditional. Someone mentioned, well, we don't have instrumental music. Well, that's not a part of our tradition. And that's the way they look at it sometimes. That's not a part of our tradition. No, that's not the thing. The thing is that we need to look at the Bible about what the Bible says about music in worship. Music, all kinds, whatever kind of music. Every time that it's mentioned in the New Testament, not the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, every time that music is mentioned, it's always singing. And in history we can see that historically instrumental music was not brought into Christian worship until about between the year 500 and 600. And it came in under a great deal of protest at that time. Most people, well, I won't say most, I'll say many people anyway, just think this is one of our traditions. And we can change that tradition just like we change the time of the Lord's Supper. The Bible doesn't say anything about when the Lord's Supper should be observed. Now, why am I mentioning all that? Well, I'm mentioning that really to say this. Paul was a Pharisee. He was wrapped up with the tradition. What were the traditions? He says, the life that I now live, I live by faith. Literally, Paul is contrasting this with the life he used to live. Because he says, now I'm living by faith, not by the works of the law. Well, what did it mean to live by the traditions? Well, one of the things that it meant was that we have to get together and decide what is the correct interpretation of this passage or that passage or something like that. So we in this group get together here and we say, okay, this is the interpretation, this is a correct interpretation of that passage. Now, we go to other people and say, you must go according to our interpretation, or else it's sinful. It's wrong. Let me give you an illustration of this. On the Sabbath, the tradition was that if you're walking through a grain field and you pick some of the little ears of grain, you know, and then you rub it in your hand and thresh it and you blow away the chaff and you eat the grain. That's okay. But, how many of these little pods can you get on the Sabbath day without it being called work? Well, if I can have one, maybe I have three. If I can have three, maybe I gotta have 100. And if I can have 100, why couldn't I just, you know, and it goes on and on. So they had to come up with an idea of what is the correct interpretation of harvesting on the Sabbath. Don't ask me how this came about. I have no idea. I couldn't find it. But here's the thing. They came up with the idea that the amount of grain that you could put into the mouth of a lamb was acceptable. Anything beyond that was work. Now, to me, well, I don't mean to be ugly, but that's dumb. That's dumb. But this tradition said that here is the official interpretation of that. How far can you walk on the Sabbath? What can you carry on the Sabbath? Well, let me show you something. I've got a pen here. If I were a very strongly Orthodox Jew, and I did look this up, if I were a very strongly Orthodox Jew and this pen, a Friday evening at 6 o'clock, if this pen is sitting on that table right there, I can't move it until the Sabbath is over. Because for me to pick that up is work. Okay? Now, somebody else says, but when you eat, you pick up the fork. Well, that's okay. And you pick up your food. Isn't that work? No, that's not work. You're feeding yourself, and that's all right. Well, let me see. You've got some rotten beans on your plate. You can't push them off of the plate because that's not your food. That's the garbage, and you can't pick up the garbage. They had all kinds of things like this so that they had 39 categories of work. 39 categories where they had defined this is work, this is not work. And then each category had a whole group of things that they defined under it. Why is that important? It's important, folks, because Paul says the life that I now live, I live by faith. I don't live by the traditions that have been passed down to me. Some traditions are very good. Some traditions are very bad. The traditions that Paul was talking about were the traditions that really interpretations that people had made over the years, and now they became law. Do you remember Jesus' statement, you make void God's law by your traditions? The traditions were elevated over and above what God had said. Where do we stand on that? The life that I live, the life that you live, Let's be sure that the things that we talk about in reference to worship, in reference to service, in reference to things that we believe and so forth, let's be sure that they're biblically based. That they're based on the idea of what does the Bible say about these things. Now, there are a number of people through the entire the entire Old Testament particularly. There are a number of people that are fine examples for us in reference to this life that we live. As you go through the book of Judges, I've mentioned this a number of times. It's just fascinating to me. As you go through that book, you'll find that there's a statement every once in a while that, and Israel did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then it will talk about how God punished them for that. And then it will say, and God raised up so-and-so. And that person became what was called a judge. That person was a military leader sometime, a political leader, a governor, or one who governed sometime. And then he was always a spiritual leader, though. Maybe I had better modify that a little bit. Samson was not so much of a spiritual leader as some of the others were. Well, what did this mean? It meant that here is the life of someone, and God is really using that life. Why? Because that person is trying to do what God said, not do what society approved or what the religious community in general approved, but what God actually says. And then we've got Joseph and Daniel and the prophets and the judges of Israel. We have all sorts of people through the entire Old Testament that tell us something about the life that we now live. One of the interesting people along this line is a fellow by the name of Isaiah. Isaiah is he's an interesting character because he apparently, from the writing of the book of Isaiah, he seems to have been a highly educated person, a very eloquent man. There's an interesting thing, though, that took place in the early part of the book of Isaiah. In the 6th chapter of Isaiah, we have what's generally referred to as the call of Isaiah. Now, I'm going to turn over there and read just a short portion. This is a beautiful, wonderful passage. I'm going to read just a short portion of that 5th chapter of Isaiah. I want you to get a view of what he looked like here. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on the throne, high and exalted, and his train filled the whole room of the whole temple. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, and with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 wings they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is filled with his glory. And the sound of their voices shook the doors, the doorposts, and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Now, here's the thing. Listen to what he says. Woe is me, I said. I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips. And I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Now, here's the thing about this. Isaiah's view of himself, when he saw the magnificence of God, the beauty of God in this temple and all this sort of thing, Isaiah's view of himself was not, I am an eloquent man, I am a good man, I am the kind of man that God wants down here on the earth. No, he says, I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the Lord, the Almighty. Now, the next few verses tell us something that's very important about what took place in this man. You see, we cannot be useful to the Lord until first we learn humility. And sometimes that's learned, as we'll see here, sometimes that's learned quickly, sometimes it's learned over a long period of time. Listen to this. Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal, which he had taken from the tongs with a tong from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for." Something happened to Isaiah. His lips were touched by this fiery coal. And symbolically, the seraph said to him, "Your sins are forgiven. Your guilt is taken away." And now a whole different aspect of this scene takes place. Stop and think about the life that I now live as we look at Isaiah. The life that he lived before, we don't know what it was. We don't know anything at all about it. But he saw his own faults. He saw himself as God saw him. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among people of unclean lips. And then this scene of the touching of his lips with a live coal. Okay. In verse 8, I heard a voice of the Lord. I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" I said, "Here am I. Send me." To me, that is one of the great statements in the whole book of Isaiah, because we see Isaiah, first of all, as he suddenly saw himself in the beauty and the magnificence of this temple, and God seated on the throne, and he saw his own insignificance. And this seems to have been kind of a new revelation for him. And he saw suddenly his guilt, the life that he lives. He saw his guilt, and then he experienced this cleansing. You see, becoming a Christian is not just joining an organization. Becoming a Christian is a conversion. It's a change in your lifestyle. It's a change in your thinking. It's a change in your behavior. It's a change in every aspect of your life. And this is what Isaiah is telling us here, I think, in this call. And then when the call of the Lord comes to him, he's a different person. Who am I going to send? Well, he didn't say, "I'm very eloquent, send me." And yet he is. As you read the book of Isaiah, it's one of the most elegant sets of poetry in the entire Old Testament. But now he sees that having experienced this cleansing from God, his whole life is changed. His life is now in the hands of God. When God says, "Who can I send?" He says, "I'm ready to go. Send me." I can't help but say, I wish I knew what his life was like prior to this time. The book of Jeremiah is somewhat like this. When God called Jeremiah, Jeremiah was afraid. He said, "I can't go. I can't do this. I'm just like a little child," he says. Well, Moses was pretty much the same way when God called him. Moses said, "Lord, I can't go. All of these reasons why I can't do this." And God kept answering his objections. And finally he went. Great people through the Bible have been people whose past lives, whose lives were changed when they came into contact with the call of God. That we don't have that exactly the same in every one of the instances, but in the places where we have the before and the after, that is certainly the idea. One of my favorites along this line is Amos. Amos was a very bold man. There was a temple in Bethel. Bethel was right on the border between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and Bethel was right on the borderline. There had been built a temple there by King Jeroboam. Because he didn't want the people to go down to Jerusalem. He was afraid he would lose their loyalty. So he built a temple there. And they had a golden calf in the temple and all this sort of thing. And where did Amos go when he started preaching? Amos went to Bethel. And he preached and taught. And he told the people about how evil and wicked they were living and what God was going to do with them. A representative of the king finally came out and said, Amos, this is the king's sanctuary. Don't preach your stuff at the king's sanctuary. Go back down to Judah. They'll pay you a good wage down there. You can preach and teach to your heart's content, but don't do it here. This is the king's sanctuary. Oh, he should not have said that to Amos. Amos came back and he said, I am not a prophet. I am not the son of a prophet. Son of a prophet was an expression that they used for a person who literally was in school to learn how to teach and preach. And so they had schools of the prophet. And the students were called the sons of the prophets. And so he says, I'm not a prophet and I'm not a son of a prophet. I was a farmer, he says. I was taking care of sycamore trees. And I was a shepherd taking care of sheep. And the Lord spoke to me and said, go to Israel, my people, and tell them of their sins. And so he said, I'm here on this mission. Stop and think now, the life that he had lived and the life that he's now living. We have no reason to believe that he was not a fine farmer, a fine godly man, but God says, I've got another job for you. I want you to go and teach the people of Israel. And so he took this so seriously. His life changed. His whole, the character of what he did, all of this changed. Now instead of being a shepherd, now instead of being a farmer, he's one of the most effective preachers that you've ever found in the Old Testament. The life that he lived. Such a change took place in reference to this man. Well, you know, just about every age of, well, certainly during my lifetime, people have always said, oh, we're living in perilous times. And, you know, from the bombing in Boston the other day, and from the 9/11 bombing and all this sort of thing, we certainly feel like we have the right to say, yes, we are living in perilous times. Well, I'm older than the rest of you in this audience. I can remember, I was in World War II, and I can remember we're living in perilous times. We have Hitler, we have Mussolini, we have Tojo, we have all of these people who are trying to destroy the very things that we stand for in life. One of the things about perilous times is that it has the capacity to identify people who are genuine deliverers, genuine leaders. And some of the finest leaders that we've had in the history of our country are men who have risen up in times of crisis. One of the finest leaders among women are women who have led at a time of crisis. Former life, new life. So Paul says, the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God. I just for what it's worth, I copied down some statistics about crime. In 1960, $570 million worth of goods were stolen in the United States in the year 1960. It's a bunch of money, folks. And even if you brought that up to date, it would be even more. Then I looked at the statistics for 2009. $13,328,962,860 in stolen property. Well, there's a big difference there. Yes, we live in times of peril, But we need to stop and think about the fact that these are the times that produce leaders in the church, in business, in society. Perilous times have a way of spawning great people. Stop and think of Abraham Lincoln. Stop and think of George Washington. Stop and think of Franklin Roosevelt. These men, and Harry Truman, these men who were governing during times of crisis. They arose to meet the challenges. Folks, that's exactly the thing that you and I need to do as time goes on. We need to arise in order to meet the crisis. Well, what can we say about some of the ingredients for a leader? I don't know who among us might be the greatest leader. And by among us, I'm thinking of nationally, I'm thinking of congregation-wise and so forth. But there's something that a godly leader seems to always possess. Number one, he possesses humility. The first thing that we look for is a person of humble character. Jesus himself was a man of humility. Oh, that didn't mean that he sat in the corner and sucked his thumb. It doesn't mean that he was a person who was withdrawn or anything like that, but he had a balanced view of himself. He knew what his capacities were. He knew what his abilities were, but he also knew that he had certain limitations. Yes, Jesus had limitations. Sometimes that's kind of hard for us to comprehend. But the reason I say that is there's just almost a magic statement made over in the book of Hebrews where it says, he was made in all points like we are, and yet without sin. So the weaknesses of Christ were very, very real. But he had a balanced view of this. He knew his weaknesses. He knew his strengths. He accepted both of them without violating either one. And so his life was balanced. That, to me, this is the best idea of humility. Because Jesus had great capacity. Jesus had a great talent. But he didn't allow that to go to his head. He had limitations. He didn't allow that to cripple him. And so he had this balanced view of himself. And it seems to me that this really is what humility is all about. So I think one of the first things that we have to look at in reference to this whole thing is that we need to learn humility. Not inferiority, not the idea that I'm not as good as anybody else, or I can't do as much as another person can do, but the acceptance of both our abilities and the acceptance also of our weaknesses. Well, Paul says, the life that I now live, I live by faith. Have you ever stopped to think of all of the things that Paul was criticized for? If you sit down and read the books of 2 Corinthians and Galatians, and you read it with the idea in mind of Paul is speaking back to people who are down on him. They were really down on him. They said, he is not an apostle on the level with the Jerusalem apostle. Why? Well, he was not one of the original 12. And so they criticized him for this. They said he writes good letters. His letters are really fine, but said he is a poor preacher. Now, they didn't put it exactly that way. They said instead, his letters are powerful, they said, but his bodily presence is weak. And so it seems to be that they're saying, Paul was not a good preacher. Paul might not have been a very good communicator as we think of eloquence and things like that. I had a teacher one time. I've called his name a number of times here. His name was J. Ridley Stroop. And Brother Stroop he had a funny voice. To listen to him speak, you would think that he was a teenager whose voice is changing, because his voice would jump up to falsetto and right back down, and it was just that way. It was kind of a joke among the students. But listen to him. He really had something to say. He really did. He was a man of great depth in the Bible, and he was a PhD in psychology, and he had gained national recognition for some of the things that he did in his psychological research. Well, these people who have defects, these people who have weaknesses, are not necessarily people that we set aside, because these are sometimes the people who have also great abilities, great talents. Well, there's one other thing that I want to mention to you. The life that I live, am I living according to the majority vote? We like to be liked. We like to be people who are in the majority. We like to have people around us who agree with us and things like this. Well, sometimes good leaders are in the minority. How would you like to have been in the majority in the days of Noah? Not very good. How would you like to have been in the majority in the days of Christ? Not very good. And you go through the Bible and you'll find that minority people played a very important role. And so I think back to the 12 spies that were sent out to Canaan. They went out and they looked around, they brought produce of the land back to the camp, and I can just see the people saying, wow, what a land this is. And the spies come back, all 12 of them say, boy, this is a land flowing with milk and honey. Hooray! You can just see them cheering now. Just think of what God has done, but we can't take it because we're too weak. They live in walled cities. There are a bunch of giants over there. They are military people, and we're just a bunch of ragtag farmers, slaves, former slaves and so forth, that have come out of Egypt. There's no way we can do this. But there were two men, the minority. There were two men, Joshua and Caleb. And these two men said, yes, we can do this. No, we can't do this. We can't do this. Naysayers, like I had said this morning, we can't do this. It's not going to work. Joshua, you and Caleb, just, 10 of you say it won't work, and you two are the only two say it will. Well, that's kind of the way we go a lot of times. We'll go with the majority vote. Right is right, whether it's majority or minority. Right is right. And what I think we need to do in thinking of the life that I now live is to take a lesson here from Paul. Paul had something to look back on. Great statement that he made to the Philippians. He said, I'm forgetting the things that are behind. What are you forgetting, Paul? Well, I'm forgetting some bad things in my life. I'm forgetting some good things too. I'm not going to allow, as I mentioned last week, I'm not going to allow the failures of the past to destroy the present. I'm not going to allow my successes of the past to fill me with such pride that I'm not willing to put in the same effort at successes in the present. And so he's a great example of this. So he says, the life that I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. I just think that's a great statement, folks. I think that's a great thing for you and me to live by. Can I say the life that I'm living right now, I'm living in the trust that I have in Jesus Christ? Or am I saying that I'm kind of doing this on my own? Paul said, this is the life that I now live. So, what kind of life am I living? When pride comes, then also comes shame. Proverbs chapter 11. We don't want the accomplishments of the past to dominate us, nor do we want the failures of the past to retard us. We're going to stand and sing an invitation song. If you're in need of responding for any reason at all, you're invited to come. Let's stand together.